All right, let's get right into it. When you think of the 1950s, you probably picture this perfect black and white world. But the reality? Well, it was way more complicated. It was a decade defined by this incredible tension, a full-on battle between this powerful, standardized American ideal and the rebellious forces that sprang up immediately to challenge it.
So on one side, you had what we'll call the ideal. You know, the dream of a suburban house with a white picket fence, the perfect nuclear family, and all the comfort that came with a booming consumer economy. But pushing back just as hard was the rebellion, a deep search for authenticity and spontaneity, a complete rejection of that whole materialistic package. And believe me, these two forces defined everything.
So, to really get the rebellion, we first have to understand what it was fighting against. How exactly was this blueprint for conformity drawn up? Because here's the thing, it didn't just happen. It was carefully engineered by some incredibly powerful forces.
And the engine that drove all this conformity, it was something called mass culture. This led to what's known as cultural homogenization, which is just a fancy way of saying a huge, diverse country starts to think, act, and live the same way. It meant millions of Americans were basically being programmed to read the same magazines, watch the same TV shows, and literally dream the exact same American dream.
So how did they build this engine? Well, it was a kind of perfect storm of three things. First, you had economic stability. The GI Bill created this massive new middle class, and they were ready to spend. Second, you had suburbanization, which gave them standardized places to live. I mean, think of Levittown, with those rows and rows of identical houses. And finally, you had the political fear of the Cold War and McCarthyism, which basically acted as a cultural enforcer, pressuring everyone to look and act the same.
And this right here is the crucial part. During the McCarthy era, any deviation from the norm, I mean, if your clothes were a little too strange, your music was a little too rebellious, or your family didn't look just right, it could be seen as un-American. Fitting in wasn't just about being popular, it was a patriotic duty. You could lose your job, get blacklisted, or even be branded an enemy of the state.
Now, for this ideal to really take hold, you needed a broadcast system that could pump it into every single home, and that tool was the television. The speed that TV took over is just staggering. By the end of the 1950s, nearly 90% of all American households owned one. It became the centerpiece of the American living room and the main pipeline for American culture.
And you have to understand, the media landscape back then was nothing like today. There was zero fragmentation. You had 3 major networks, that's it. This meant that on any given night, pretty much every family in America was watching the exact same show, hearing the exact same message. It created this incredibly powerful shared cultural language.
So what was that programming telling them? Well, shows like Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best, they weren't just entertainment. They were a form of cultural engineering. They really acted as a kind of instruction manual, showing millions of people exactly how they were supposed to behave.
These shows hammered home very specific roles. You had the kind but emotionally distant working dad, the cheerful, totally dependent housewife, and of course the perfectly behaved white middle-class kids. This wasn't just telling a story, it was handing out a script for how to be a good American citizen.
And this whole system was fueled by a radical new kind of advertising. Before the war, ads told you what a product did, but after the war, they became all about psychological gratification. You weren't just buying a car to get from A to B, you were buying the newest model to show everyone you'd made it. Products became symbols of your identity, proof that you belonged.
But here's the thing about culture. When you try to control it that tightly, a pushback is inevitable. And what's so fascinating is how quickly that resistance started. It didn't come from politicians, it came from the fringes, from artists, writers, and musicians.
You have to start with the Beat Generation. These guys looked at the whole conformist package, the suburbs, the consumerism, the soul-crushing 9-to-5 grind, and they just said, nope. They were on this desperate search for something real, something authentic, in a world they saw as totally superficial.
And their art was their weapon. Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl, for example, wasn't just a poem. It was described as a direct missile aimed right at the heart of mainstream values, a full-blown critique of capitalism, conformity, and the whole system. He wasn't just observing the culture, he was actively trying to tear it down.
And this feeling, this critique of phoniness, even started to break into the mainstream. J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield gave a voice to countless young people who just felt in their bones that the perfect adult world they were supposed to want was nothing more than an emotional sham.
And while the Beats were waging war in print, an even bigger battle was being fought over the airwaves, rock and roll. You can see the tension perfectly in these two pioneers. On one hand, you have Chuck Berry, a black musician who is a lyrical genius writing these anthems for teenage freedom.
And then you have Elvis Presley, who took that sound to a massive white audience, and his performance style, that overt sexuality, was a direct assault on the buttoned-up, conservative norms of the day.
The rebellion wasn't just happening in art and music, it was intellectual too. Economists like John Kenneth Galbraith started to attack the consumer engine itself. He argued that America was obsessed with creating manufactured private desires, like needing tail fins on your car, while completely neglecting actual public needs like schools and roads.
But maybe the most profound challenge of all wasn't about what you bought or what you listened to, it was about who you were allowed to be. In the early 1950s, right in the thick of that intense conformity, the Mattachine Society was founded. This was one of the very first organized LGBTQ+ rights groups in the entire country.
I mean, think about that. In a culture where the Leave It to Beaver family was presented as the only acceptable model, the simple act of existing as this group was revolutionary. They were demanding to be seen in a society that was literally designed to make them invisible. Their activism was a direct threat to that entire homogeneous ideal.
So, when we pull back and look at the whole picture, what's the big takeaway? The true legacy of the 1950s isn't the idyllic suburb, and it's not the rebellious beatnik. It's the constant, simmering tension between the two. This really captures that push and pull perfectly. You have this massive push towards conformity from things like Levittowns, McCarthyism, and the three big TV networks. But at the exact same time, you've got this powerful pull from the counterculture, the beats, rock and roll, and early LGBTQ+ activism. It was a constant cultural tug-of-war. And understanding that dynamic is absolutely crucial, because it shows us that all the massive social change of the 1960s didn't just appear out of thin air. The seeds were already there. In fact, they were growing fiercely right underneath those perfectly manicured lawns of 1950s suburbia. The rebellion always starts right away. And that brings us to one final thought for you to chew on. If the conformity of the 1950s was engineered by just 3 television networks, what forces are engineering our world? What are the modern media forms, social media algorithms, streaming platforms, targeted ads, that are standardizing our norms and maybe subtly demanding conformity from us right now?